Ever since I was a kid, all I wanted to be was an explorer. Sail the seven seas, find new worlds.
But Uncle D, everything's already been found.
What? Like everything?
Well, yeah.
Oh, man.
Well, so much for that. But if I can't be an explorer, I can still be an adventurer. So I bought a motorhome and I'm hitting the open road. My name is Dustin Porter, and this is Destination Adventure.
Just got attacked by a bird. You doing all right? Huh? Just a quick drive today, like 1 or 2 hours. Should be nice.
There are hundreds of ghost towns in Canada, and most of them are mining towns. But there's only 2 ghost cities, and this is one of them. I guess Sandon, I would say it's like the Fort McMurray of 130 years ago. In those years, it was one of the greatest silver mining districts in the world, and Canada's wealthiest mines here for a period of time in the very late 1800s. Endless amounts of young people wanting to come here and dreams of making their fortune, and of course, wages that were several times higher than the average Canadian wage. What they didn't know in a lot of cases was how deadly the working conditions were. They had the latest technology here. It was one of the first places in Canada to become highly mechanized. So things like electricity and compressed air came here very early on, and in many cases before rules and regulations around it or even a lot of knowledge. And so hydroelectricity came here shortly after Niagara Falls, which was the birthplace of hydroelectricity in the world. It would seem that there were about 5,000 residents right in the city of Sandon itself. And then there was another 2,300 that lived at the mining camps up in and around the mines. So that workforce would typically, in a mine, they would work 6 days, 12-hour days. And Saturday night, they'd be free and, money flowing out of their pockets. They'd come to town, and so they would descend on Sandon from high in the hills. They'd come down here and add to that 2 railways with passenger trains coming and going every day. So on a Saturday night, there was probably close to 10,000 people here with a density of something like Hong Kong. All kinds of gambling establishments and theaters, a huge red light district with probably 3 times more brothels than there were saloons, but there were roughly 30 saloons in Sandon. The city was bursting at its seams, so they built on every square inch they could find, and up the hills. There were streets all up on the side hills here as well, and then you had to factor in 2 railroads, both coming into the valley and ending here at Sandon. So, space was a big problem. Today it's much harder to envision, just simply because the forest cover is closing in again, and there was barely a blade of grass standing here in Sandon in the early years. Every usable tree was cut for timbers or lumber, and there was a huge demand for it. Every major kind of calamity has happened here. In a boom city like Sandon, the first decade was the dominant decade. That's when most things happened here. Probably less happened in the next 100 years than happened in the first decade. So Sandon went through this enormous growth spurt in the beginning, And then, of course, being that the city was built of wood, that was the local material. The fire was inevitable, and then in Sandon, because of the density here, a lot of the streets were only 20 feet wide, many 3- and 4-story buildings, and they were one against another. So once the fire got going, it was really hard to stop it. When the big fire happened in 1900, the population was already beginning to decline. So the second rebuilding, the confidence wasn't there to build a lot of buildings with brick and stone, so most of the post-fire buildings were also built of wood. In the valley bottom, you had 3 principal streets that were parallel to the valley. Rico Street being the earliest of the main streets, then the street they called Main Street, so that was, the creek was running under that street, and then this street here, Slocan Star Street, was kind of the industrial street, and it was right alongside the Canadian Pacific Railroad here. Today it all looks strange because, of course, the river has returned to kind of more of its natural channel, and people look at it and think, well, this is a strange place. The buildings face the river rather than the street, but then, of course, that's all changed since these buildings were built. One of the famous features of Sandon was the incredible flume that carried the river right through the downtown, and it was underneath the main street. And so it was a beautiful wooden street on the top. The creek was everything. It was the sewer, that's where all the sewer pipes came into the flume. There were trap doors at intervals so that along the street where you could open it up and dump your garbage. Most streets in towns were sort of slop of horse manure and everything else, in mud. And here they had this beautiful clean wooden street, and the river flowed underneath it, and of course they could just dump their garbage down the trap doors, so Sandon didn't have a garbage dump. It was unlike a lot of the old mining towns. That structure had to be capable of carrying all that flow of debris during freshet, which includes boulders as big as Volkswagens. It's amazing, it worked for almost 60 years. Today we would say it was built way too small. And the other problem it had is it had 2 significant bends in the flume. In that bend, it was the perfect place for logs and debris to jam in there. In the spring of '55, it plugged with logs, and there weren't sufficient people here to deal with unjamming it. And of course, in no time it backed up with debris and boulders and everything. And the water had only one place to go, and that was down through the streets. And it tore up the streets of Sandon and left it in a horrible mess. The flume was ultimately Sandon's undoing, I guess you could say. It was the final straw that led to people abandoning it completely. Sandon, when I was a kid, there were still 200 buildings here. But what happened to our history? We tore it down for lumber and bricks. Not even salvage rights in a lot of cases. It was so commonplace for the buildings to be under demolition here. People just came up and took them. And in a lot of cases, some of the bigger, more prominent ones were actually sold for nominal amounts of money. And people came up here, took what they wanted, discarded the rest. And Sandon was just one enormous pile of wreckage here, when I was young. And now it's looking a whole lot more beautiful, but sadly all those great buildings were wrecked, and in most cases for pittance. When I first started to really see the importance of saving this, very few others did, and all my co-workers, which were employed in Sandon, making good money here because the mines continued up until 1993. But those people that worked with me, they just shook their heads and said, why do you even care? Why don't you burn them down? They're just old fire hazards, dilapidated derelicts, and they didn't see them as history. Sadly, too late for a lot of those original buildings. The trolley buses are really a super interesting part of Sandon's modern history. Sandon has been basically a refuge for a number of different groups and number of things over the years. These were fabulous vehicles. They were built by the forerunner of Bombardier, Canadian car, and it utilized a factory that during World War II was producing airplane fuselages and wings, high quality aluminum craftsmanship in aircraft construction. Between 1946 and 54, they manufactured these very high quality trolleys, and 15 Canadian cities ended up building their systems and utilizing them. There was a series of events that happened. Expo 86 came along, and the theme of Expo, well, it was originally supposed to be called Transpo, and it was the chance for British Columbia to show the world our modernness in the field of transportation. But to the embarrassment of the politicians in Vancouver, the vast bulk of people were still moved on decades-old electric trolley buses. So they decided they had to go, and they ordered 300 brand new electric trolley buses from Western Flyer in Winnipeg, and they were delivered to Vancouver ahead of Expo, and they got the old ones out of sight and pretended they didn't exist anymore. Years later, a very interesting man became the CEO of TransLink in Vancouver. His name was David Stumpo, and he had been the manager of the transit system in San Francisco. And I think his dad had been the manager of Philadelphia Transit, cities that both experimented with vintage transit equipment, refurbished it, put it into the fleets, and in San Francisco, it put San Francisco on the map in many respects. So people today, when they think of San Francisco, they think of riding a trolley. He became aware of this yard full of these ancient Brill trolley buses built by Canadian Car. Unfortunately, David got terminated, and his successor, as seems to happen in BC politics, immediately targeted everything that he had done. And so David's project was terminated and immediately relegated to scrap. So at that point, all these historical trolleys were going to be scrapped. That's when my phone began to ring. There were kind of two requests. One is they needed a place to keep them in safety until things ironed out politically. And then the other aspect was how to get them here. We were in a good position to help because our family was in the heavy truck transport industry. So there was a period of time there several years ago where over 200 of these historic trolleys were scrapped. But fortunately, we had an opportunity to work with the scrap dealer, and we salvaged a lot of the things that were of nominal scrap value, but they were important for the ultimate restoration of the vehicles, and we were able to save a good sample of vehicles from across Canada. The project as it sits is that there's 15 trolleys preserved, one to represent each of the 15 cities in Canada that had electric trolley systems. And the ultimate idea is still to follow through with David's plan, which would be to refurbish them and put them back into the Vancouver fleet.
Making this video ended up being much more personal to me than I thought, and that's because of Hal. Over the last 50 years, all the time, the money, the effort that's gone into preserving Sandon, that's all been Hal. And that's much the same as where I started with this YouTube channel. So I really want to thank all of my patrons that help make it possible for me to go out and make these videos and share it with all of you. So thank you.